The Prime Minister just spoke about the first industrial revolution and the current one. One value that I hope we can keep from earlier industrial revolutions is the importance of good timing and schedules. So, before we launch into discussions, a few administrative notes. We'll be here in this room until 11 a.m. At the beginning of the coffee break, which starts at 11, we will take group photos of heads of delegations and of speakers, and then we'll go into parallel sessions. Lunch will be served from 12:45 to 2 p.m., and heads of delegation have a separate lunch. We will then reassemble here at 3:15 p.m., and following the wrap-up, we will move to the most important part of the day, cocktails, at about 5 p.m. Good. Now let's get on to the main course. In order to frame today's discussion, we're going to start with a conversation with two thinkers and leaders whose experience in business and in academia is grounded in decades of practical experience building AI systems. Chris Bos is CEO and founder of Arago, an AI-based business automation company whose vision is to transform traditional companies into future-proof AI-enabled enterprises, and a researcher with a focus on graph theory, machine reasoning, and machine learning. And Joanna Bryson is a transdisciplinary researcher on the structure and dynamics of human and animal-like intelligence, covering topics from AI through autonomy and robot ethics, and on to human cooperation. And we will ask them both to take the long view on how we extract value from the tools and technologies that we call AI. Joanna, Chris, please come up to the stage.
Where do you want to sit?
Either way. So, to read the headlines, we're in the midst of an AI race. The US and China, alternatively, are in the lead, and Europe is a distant has-been. And races can be pretty fascinating things to watch. But you kind of lose focus on the big picture when you look at the second-by-second, play-by-play. So instead of thinking of the current developments as an AI race, what I hope we can discuss is how we look at the long run. The question I want to ask both of you is, what are the decisions that we need to take now to ensure a better future for our children? And Chris, we're going to start with you. You founded a B2B process automation company back in 1995. So you've seen a couple of AI winters and springs, and you kind of have a generational view of the question of how companies actually get value from AI. How do we do that? How do we extract that value?
So, well, thank you very much. And I was not that visionary. I founded a research company. And I wanted to do cross-border research, and this is why I couldn't do it at a university at that time. I think that's also getting better. But I believe that our primary question is that we're changing a lot of models all the time. Right now, there is tremendous value that we can harvest immediately from artificial intelligence, from applying artificial intelligence, from automating stuff. And the question is, who can do that? Will it be only the few platform companies that are out there, or will it be the general economy out there? But then immediately takes us to a much more profound question. How do we make that happen to entire societies? How do we actually get the benefit from artificial intelligence to each individual? And that then takes us to value systems and all the profound questions that lead to this competition or race that you see between the US, China, the West, and the East. And we don't know where Europe stands, but that's a totally different discussion on this question. I believe that what we currently see is things moving in very opposite directions. We have a vivid discussions on ethics and morality in the area of AI, where there's fantastic work being done. A lot of the hangers-on to this, unfortunately, discuss things that may be 150 years away, rather than what is happening right now. On the other hand, we have societies that seem to have deteriorating interest in ethics and morality if it becomes acceptable lying to each other every day and every minute. So if we want to harvest the value of AI, I believe the most important thing is that we focus on societies and get the mindsets right and accept that we're the responsible entities and that we have to put the goal of where we want to go first. Once we've done that, we can go into the question of actually implementing AI. I see that most companies deal with AI today. Everybody wants the marketing tag. It's either for getting better financing or it's for looking good on stages. But the real problem that you see is very few actually implement it. We have this prototyping culture. Everything is a pilot of something, and it's very few companies actually take that stuff into production. Because they don't take it into production, they have this kind of attitude that policy and politics should fix it for them and basically force it down their throats, so they have someone to blame in the end, who is responsible for the inevitable failures in places. There is going to be failures, and we're still looking for someone who takes the blame. Corporates want that to be politics. Societies would like that to be the bad capitalists, and so on. I think that the only way is that we actually start moving together. The challenge that we're finding is too big to be left in this circle of stuff. I've seen some very positive movements here where trade unions and companies start working together and changing that, but it is small little initiatives that need to grow. So let me make a couple of statements, things that we should be doing to actually derive value from AI, because after 150 years of industrialization, which is basically 150 years of optimization and efficiency gain, I think it's time to get the humanity back into humans, and maybe the repetitive and already known stuff back into machines where they belong. So number one, I would say, is we should start implementing things. And we should be willing to manage risk and take risk. We have a risk avoidance culture which is at the point of ignoring risk, which does not make sense at all. We need to manage risk, consciously take risk, and iterate much more quickly on the bad experiences and the good experiences that we make. We need to put out some principles that will tell us, at least in our Western cultures, that we're not willing to leave people behind. Because if you want people to love the future who already have an okay life, it is very hard to convince them if the only thing that you give them is risk. You have to give them a safety net. And I don't mean this in the terms of basic income. I mean this in the terms of, we will make sure you can come along. Number three, we will have to make sure that we do not have implementation stopped by making this a 100% effort. Like a lot of times we see people say like, oh, we can only implement this for 90% or 95% or whatever, but we can't implement it for 100%, so we don't do it. Like autonomous driving. People die every day on the roads that would be completely unnecessary because we are not able to take that risk, and we're not able to create an insurance, or companies are not willing to create these concepts that are out there. We need to put this out there. We're not leaving people behind. Number four is we need to regulate, but we should not regulate to defeat something. In Europe, for example, we kind of added to GDPR, which was a great idea because we need to deal with data and the ownership of data and the privacy of data and so on. But we added a type of law that would go against platform companies. I think we need a switch in regulation from blocking stuff to actually competing with stuff. Things that are out there, if we don't like them, we can compete with them. We can make better offerings because people are actually using what they like. People are very much driven by comfort now, much more immediate comfort than future, and we need to bring that back to them. This is why we need regulation that is open for future, that is open for risk-taking, that is open for what comes next and iterates much more quickly than we're used to it. And last but not least, I believe that we need to make a huge effort in communicating among people, because all the data that we're talking about and all the machines that learn from this data basically learn from us. If we interact with each other, if we interact with things, if things interact with things, data is created. It's a mapping mechanism for reality. If we behave crappy, machines are going to behave crappy, and no type of regulation is going to prevent that. The effort of changing human minds, as we've already heard, is the biggest one ever. But it's such a human endeavor. And what we have here is the biggest opportunity that has presented itself in many centuries, because for the first time we get an opportunity to actually fix problems like the pension system that didn't cope with the demographic change and so on that is coming on. We actually get the opportunity to fix that without violence or a big disruption to society or a lost generation. We should take this opportunity and make those changes for us all.
Thank you, Chris. So, Joanna, like Chris, you've been in this domain for a generation, and in fact, one of your early gigs was working with Lego as a consultant, which I find fascinating. I was a kid at the time, so I maybe was using some of your products. And I also can't help but note that you're the author of a chapter provocatively titled that robots should be slaves. So,
all right. Well, I didn't want to go there, but thank you. I think when we're talking about delivering value, we need to think about what is value? How do we measure it? And obviously, liquidity is an important part. What you didn't mention is a decade before I was working for Lego, I was in the financial industry in Chicago. And to slightly provocatively disagree with something Chris said, but maybe not what you wanted, is I decided after being in industry a short time, I wanted to go where you could really innovate and take a lot of risk. And I think that's what academia is for. Universities are something that's an infrastructure that we have in order to take risk and to test out new ideas. Certainly we're not good at writing the code that actually runs. But I want to come back to, I mostly agree with many of the things that Chris was saying about like the human-centeredness and the right attitude towards how we think about technology and how we're changing society with it. But I want to emphasize back to this idea of a race that we tend to focus a lot of attention on two regions that have sort of metastatized companies that have enormous amounts of power, and then we say, how is Europe falling behind? But if you actually look at what defines an economy, for whatever reason, economists have decided that an economy is defined by a currency. So even only looking at the Eurozone, not looking at all of the EU, and certainly not looking at all of Europe, we're already one of the top 3 economies. And it's not even clear which one, because we don't hype ourselves, right? Unlike the other two. So how can you say that we're falling behind in AI when clearly AI is core to everything we're doing? I agree. I loved the introduction by the Prime Minister. AI is here. It's pervasive. It's technology that allows us to perceive and to act, right? It's just a means by which we can produce action automatically, and we can have means for perceiving more than we could before. So Europe has been turning this into high quality of life that makes people want to move here for a long time. I was just in Austria in December for the ICT meeting, the EU ICT meeting, and I'd lived there from 2007 to 2009, and somebody was astounded to hear an Anglosphere person speak German, and they said, oh, you were here a decade ago, you wouldn't believe how we've changed. Now digital is our biggest economy. It used to be the arts when I was there, right? And I think this is pervasive across Europe. So there are issues. There's big issues with the fact that they have to do with sovereignty, about having these transnational companies that do have so much power, which are influencing so much of the world. However, again, speaking of liberal democracy, thinking about people who are moving forwards and really trying to change the world for good, I think the interests of the tech industry align really well with liberal democracy, because unlike some of the other industries, it really, really matters, especially if you're doing bartering, free transactions. If you're bartering for data, you want as many people with good educations, decent access to food, decent access. Also, you want people to be able to cross borders so you can hire them. But you want a lot of the things that the EU stands for. So I think it makes sense to figure out how are we going to handle these new problems and new challenges. What AI is doing is changing the landscape. It's not just AI, it's ICT in general, but AI is sort of the part of communication technology that we anthropomorphize. So we suddenly recognize it if it talks to us in English or any other natural language. But the change has been happening for decades, and a lot of the things that we've seen with respect to even parenting, the shifts in parenting, so that the family acting like an organism, that nobody takes a step without checking with each other. We didn't have that before we had this kind of communication technology. So that's at the very micro level. At the macro level, the fact that what it means to be sovereign when you are absolutely dependent on other nations, and it's not even clear which nations, the Canary Islands, other nations' tech industry for how your people get around. It's an interesting new set of problems. I think there are problems that we can solve. I think the GDPR in general, I'm sure there's details we can fix. But in general, it shows that a region can organize itself, a region of nations, of independent nations. There's no laws of the EU, if anyone outside the EU doesn't know this. There's treaties that the EU agrees, and then the nations implement the laws, right? So a collaboration of nations was able to say, hey, look, our citizens' data is part of their being. It's like the airspace over a person, right? So if we allow people access to that, we're allowing people to shove our citizens to change their behavior, right? So we need to defend that. And that was brilliant. And a lot of people said, oh, nobody's going to sign up to this. It's going to be a disaster. It's going to freeze innovation. We're not going to be able to go forward. And in fact, it's true that you can no longer look at local American newspaper anymore, and I find that sometimes annoying. But by and large, everybody signed up. And the tech giants I've talked to have said, we thought this was going to be a problem, and it did cost, especially for publishers. There was a big penalty, and we can't just keep changing the GDPR. So it did cost, but they're saying, but now we have access to 28 countries currently, 28 countries, and that's great. And I've also had Chinese colleagues say, now we know exactly what it costs if we violate your laws, and that's great. And you might think, oh, that's terrible. We don't want the Chinese to be figuring out how much money to spend to violate our laws. But no, but that's the point of a treaty. The whole point of a treaty is saying, this is how much this matters to us. Know this in advance, and we've also told you what the penalties will be if you violate, right? So I think that this shows that something that I think we should hope that a lot of regions can do. There should never be a single government. We need diversity. We need different ways of thinking. And I really don't think it's not just about Europe. There's an awful lot of people out there doing really interesting things. India has said, we're going to be the tech giant for the developing world. If they do that, there's a lot of the developing world, and it's developing fast, and it's a lot, it has a lot better access to education and food and all kinds of things than it had before. The inequality in the OECD is increasing, but the number of people that are in extreme poverty has been crashing. So that we are really helping humanity here, and humanity is going to start doing more stuff. That's part of where all this change is coming from. So we need to be thinking broadly.
So I think you've both outlined a positive and an optimistic view that says that we have the institutional toolbox. We just need to start taking some more risks and innovating a bit. Joanna, do you share this sort of risk-taking centric view that Chris outlined, or are there problems with taking these risks?
I wouldn't say it's only about taking risks. So I do think we need to explore, but the idea of regulation is that you need to create a sufficient stability so that people can keep innovating, right? And so it's not just about how fast do you get the innovations to market. It's about, is the market stable enough that we can retain all those good things and keep going forward? So in a period of very high inequality like this, you do tend to see like incredible explosions of the arts and lots of new ideas. You also see lots of wars and destruction. So we want to figure out how to get that balance a little better. And that was one of the things I agree about, bringing people along with us. And not just people in our own countries. We need to globally make sure that people are able to help their people be a part of our success, because we are facing some very hard global issues, and we are going to continue to have increased mobility, increased communication. So we need to be thinking about how to cooperate with people, but also to allow them to be diverse and to really be changing and creating new ideas and creating solutions to the problems they have in their regions.
Chris, you talked about communication as your final point. And I think that was really insightful, because as I was going through the rest of your list, the thing that kept hitting me was these sound like they're things we can do in principle, but I'm not sure that politics can execute on that. So I'm wondering, if we do want to hold a more optimistic view that we can handle these things, what does politics need to bring to the equation to actually help you execute on this kind of strategy?
So for the longest time, I had absolutely nothing to do with politics. And when I was asked to join the Digital Council in Germany, I kind of had this opinion, okay, you can't say no to this, but it's going to be a big waste of time. And it turned out not to be, simply because I can see that there is a lot of people in politics across party lines. Let's cut out the extremist parties, right? And the ones who are just focused on marketing for their own power. But most parties that are out there have a huge interest in building a future. And the ability to regulate something, and the willingness to regulate something and create a framework that we can live in, and that we can innovate in, and that we know how much it is to take a risk, and what are the principles we have to adhere to, and how do we deal with people, and how do we make sure we live in a way. That willingness is extremely high. And I'm kind of converted. I believe that we have a much bigger issue on the commercial side now than on the political side, because even the willingness to iterate. I mean, what do you think in a country like Germany, having an administration start to work in an agile manner, that was totally unimaginable a couple of years ago, and now this is happening. Maybe because Estonia demonstrated it, I don't know, but it is really happening. And I believe that we have the biggest blocker currently is on the corporate side, because so many people feel that their business models still hold up for a few years. But I believe that we have to make these changes now in order to be strong in the future. Right now is still the time when we have the resources to make the change. If we have to make the change at a time where we don't have the resources, it's going to be way more painful. And here's another indication of this very strange thing, right? Is today I hear more trade union bosses talk about implementing AI than I hear CEOs of really, really putting AI into their core business.
Yeah. Now, I want to say that I wouldn't say I'm entirely optimistic, and that might be because of some of the consequences of AI and on the politics of both the countries I have passports in, Britain and America. It's obvious that when maybe it's not obvious, it has become obvious that when we put so much stuff into the digital domain, we allow ourselves to be influenced, to be hacked. Cybersecurity becomes an issue. So we do have a huge number of challenges. In Chicago, where I grew up, politics was a spectator sport. We watched it just like we watched baseball and football. So I was always somewhat engaged in it, but really thinking that you cannot be a part of politics it's a privilege. It means that your system is all working so well that you can think that you're actually taking care of yourself. You don't even see it. And I think one of the things that we've learned about AI and politics both is that that's a mistake. People used to seek invisibility. They called it transparency from the human-computer interaction perspective. But then you're actually exposing yourself to problems. And what we need, what now the new thing we're saying is that transparency requires appearance. That we do need to know and see how these things are delivering value to us so that we can value them and assess what we're doing. And we need to know when our devices are uploading our intimate details into places that may or may not be well defended, clouds, we need to understand these kinds of things.
So you've both touched on this core question of how politics and our values intersect with companies, both companies that maybe are a bit laggards and companies that are doing innovative things, perhaps without regard for these values. That interface seems to have broken down a little bit. Both of you, any thoughts on how we can rebuild that interface? We have a fairly multidisciplinary crowd here together. What are the kinds of conversations we should be having for the rest of today?
Oh, well, that's a cool... Can I go first?
Okay. I believe that the biggest thing that we can achieve is to start having respect for people who try. That's the biggest thing, because currently you try something, it doesn't work, you're screwed. And that even didn't used to be, not at all. American culture is becoming American culture as well. And it's very, if you want to move forward, you have to try, you have to be able to say, no, I was wrong, and do it again. Today, there is so little incentive of saying, no, I was wrong, that we actually have to, like, people stick with bullshit for way too long. This is just the motivation. So if we want to do something, I would say that's probably the biggest single lever we have. And the second one is we'll have to figure out how to not just do good regulation, but actually make money on top of it, right? I mean, exporting GDPR is a great thing. And it might propagate the values, but there's also a way to make money out of this and to keep economic positions. I have a lot of discussions where people go like, yeah, but we're going to have problems with AI in cybersecurity or even in the military space and so on. I say, well, but the only way you're going to prevent people from using AI in a way you don't want them to use it is you've got to be so far ahead that you tell that other guy to, you know what, don't even try.
Okay. Right, so I disagree.
That's good.
Yeah. No, well, let me actually start back to the main question, which was about how do we integrate with politics. I think it's really interesting and important to realize that quite a lot of the more mature industries already do. So that they understood that that was part of what they needed to do. And there was licensing. If you're in architecture, your buildings get inspected, your undergraduates get licensed before they're allowed to practice. And that didn't used to be true. But buildings change the entire cityscape, and if they fall down, people get killed, people are unhappy, and so we figured out how to regulate architecture. I think it's similar for ICT. We are changing the world, and we're doing it in ways that are mostly interesting, but sometimes hazardous, and we need to be integrating more. And I think there's some really basic things. We don't want everybody to do everything, so we want to modularize still, but we do want to have these points. And so I like, for example, that Microsoft has a technology diplomacy branch now, right? They're out actually talking to governments and hopefully understanding them, like real diplomats having to learn the language. I think a lot of the tech industry should be sort of thinking that way. Again, they may have to aggregate when it's SMEs. They aren't going to each have a tech diplomat. But similarly, what government really needs is they just need regulatory bodies, sort of like they have environmental agencies. They need digital agencies that know how to read software revision logs. So be able to check whether good practice was followed by a corporation, if they followed best practice, if they practiced due diligence. The same thing that you can do with banks, the same thing you can do with cars. And in fact, this is already happening for AI in the automotive industry. So there was a case in Germany where a car was basically on cruise control, but unfortunately someone had a stroke, and it wasn't obvious that they weren't asleep. The car proceeded and killed an entire family, except for a father was left wounded. And they went and checked, and the company could show they'd followed due diligence, they'd followed all best practice, nobody had known this stroke might happen, and they successfully defended themselves. So that's what everybody else, that's what, Facebook, if they're being challenged like you did something bad, they got to be able to show, yeah, here's where we made all these decisions, here's who is accountable for them. Was it best practice? And I honestly don't know. I've read, but apparently it was read by an ex-Googler, so who knows, that 70% of the industry said we would never, ever sell personal data. And 30% of the industry said, yeah, here's our personal data. You want some? And so if it was a best practice that some companies violated, those companies should be held account for that, right? So that it's just like any other industry, and it's been exceptional because it's new, but it's a core industry now. And so we do need to have some kinds of expertise, but it's not that big of a deal. It's not magic. We're just regulating the human behavior of the humans who build the AI. You don't have to understand every intricate detail of how the model learned what it learned. You have to understand how was it trained, how was it tested, was it really ready for release, was it properly maintained, just like if it was any other industry.
Oh, this brings us to something interesting, right? Is also the question
in 35 seconds.
Okay, I'll try. It brings us something interesting, the question of, do we have to accept that all AIs are black boxes, or can we actually ask for explainability? And I believe that if we want trust, we need explainability.
That is more than a 30-second thing, and there's all kinds of explanation. And I just mentioned one, which is how did you build it? That's one kind of explanation. I agree that for companies that are trying to establish trust, they may choose technologies that reveal themselves in other ways too. So,
I think you guys have to track down Chris and Joanna for a debate on explainability and how it relates to this iterative vision during the coffee break. But I want to thank you both for getting this discussion started. Please give Joanna and Chris a hand.
Thank you.
Thank you.